wine here, and some casually placed books. Young, Freud, also young, Yalom, and firewood, keeping with the fireside chat theme. So a couple of months back I did a talk about symbols for open learning, but I kind of rushed through a lot of the material. But I'm going to lay out some material that's going to be kind of similar, but try and develop it a little bit more. And I have some notes here. I had a longer script, but I'm going to rely on this. So I suppose first of all what I'm going to talk about is Karen Maroda first of all, because I think Garrett Stack mentioned Karen Maroda to me, but she talks a lot about, and I'm going to have to do a lot of definition. That was a thing that was a problem when I was doing the talk on open learning. You expect people to know all of the things that you know, so I'm probably going to rely on you to make some of the definitions. So Karen Maroda talks a lot about transference and counter-transference. So maybe if you could fill us in on what transference and counter-transference is, because there's a lot about that in this. So if you want to take it away, and I'll browse through my notes and be Bicky in the tea. It's coffee.
It's very popularized in television now, it's just being loved, but it's also with other emotions. For instance, previous conceits and ideas you've had about people, or perhaps a silly pathogenic rule, something you might not have even known you had about someone, can sometimes slip through in the therapy setting. So I suppose Irvin D Yalom was, and you'll mention this, Dan, very popular piece of counter-transference, or maybe just straight transference in this case, was where I suppose it was counter-transference, because it was where he had a patient, and this is shown in Love's Executioner, who was a fat girl, or she was a fat young girl who kind of became a woman over the 2 years of therapy she had with them. And in that case, he had a serious problem with fat people, or people who are overweight. He disliked them. He couldn't help but feel dislike and disdain for her as much as he wanted to.
He talks about like the elephantine folds in her jeans.
Yeah, and the way that she seemed to be sitting on herself as a seat.
In the text. But I suppose when I was giving the first talk, I really should have done down transference to be like, okay, you have two people in a room, but they are bringing, and there's a relationship between the therapist and the patient.
Yeah.
But they're bringing their early childhood relationships and every other sort of relationship to that relationship. Anything that's ambiguous can have something projected onto it. So I could say something which is on the surface of it neutral, and then they'll say, why are you always giving out to me? And you wouldn't put it as bluntly as this, but you'd say like, I'm not giving out to you. You're kind of seeing something that's maybe more your own material. But it's useful because you can see the other issues in their life through the relationship. And some people say that you can steer around transference. I think Rogers talks about avoiding, you just point out transference or
yeah, you don't engage with it.
Some of these other guys, they just point out, and I love Rogers, don't get me wrong. For people who don't, got introduced. I still haven't introduced Karen Maroda yet. Carl Rogers, big humanist psychologist, all about the power of the relationship. The relationship is the thing that heals. But still, I think transference is at the core of this. But back to Maroda. Well, it's the core of the latest stuff. Maroda. So she's a Milwaukee, Wisconsin-based psychologist. Deals a lot with counter-transference. My understanding of counter-transference is, okay, so the patient will bring all their own stuff from their past to it, but the therapist will also bring their own stuff to it, their own material from their past, and that's the counter-transference. And what Maroda would argue is that there's a benefit to, this counter-transference. Maybe, and there is a relationship between the two, in that the patient will say, they want you to act out a particular role, and you might play along with that, and that might have some therapeutic effect. So that's enough about transference for the moment. I'm just going to park that concept there, and then I'm going to revisit it in a while. But what I'm talking about is symbolization. So I suppose the first thing to do is to stress the importance of symbolization. So just to refer to my notes briefly, I actually do need my glasses because I'm so blind. Sorry about that. I thought I could do it without it because of the reflection, but I can't. So she talks about borderline personality disorder patients, and I think James and myself are broadly on the same page, at least in public, that the DSM labels, you know, they don't really represent individual experience. People are completely different, blah blah blah. But unofficially, borderlines do exist and are the bane of the therapeutic world, as I said in the other talk. So what does a borderline do? They split. So that would be a big feature of the disorder. So everything is good or bad. They might self-harm. There'd be impulsivity in a few different areas. Complete wreck the heads for therapists. The staff hate them because, you know, they try and pit people against one another, that kind of thing. And now finally we get to symbolism. The only way that Maroda, this Wisconsin-based psychologist, could get through to these worst patients is through symbolization. And there are 3 different examples of, I think they're all borderline patients that she has. So the first one is she has a patient that moves around a lot. She says that she's like a prize fighter, you know, you can't pin her down. And that resonated with that patient. And with another borderline patient, or maybe it's the same borderline patient, but borderline nonetheless, she says that your emotional responses are like using a bazooka to kill a fly. And that, again, connected with her experience in a way that a simple hard fact description wouldn't. And to stress more the importance of symbolism, I'll move on to Rollo May, who you know as well is the sort of one of the mentors of Yalom. And he had a book to do with symbolism and religion and that kind of thing. And he talks about a patient who was a law student and had problems with his mother. It said he had a morbid dependence on his mother. And the symbol there is he has a dream with a cave. But what I want to stress with this example that I'm bringing in here is you could say on the one hand, look, you've got a problem, your mother is blah blah blah, you need to do this. And that wouldn't work. What I want to say is, if you say to someone you have a morbid dependence on their mother, they might cut their mother out. They might turn away affection from women where they don't need to. They might go to that extreme. But what the symbol does is it captures a different poles of experience. So the symbol recognizes that no, there's a healthy aspect to the relationship with your mother, and that needs to be accepted. So like there's a dynamic element in a symbol. So with the cave in the dream of this particular patient, he has 1 foot in the cave and 1 foot out of the cave, or there's a comfortable aspect to the dream. And you can have all the well-reasoned arguments in the world that you can put to a patient like this. But oftentimes what a patient will do is they'll say like, oh, I think my problem is I have this neurotic construct, or I think I let myself be overwhelmed by other people, or I don't have proper boundaries. But the reason that they say it in that way is precisely because they want to avoid the vital power or the immediacy, as Rollo would say, of the symbol. And when Maroda was talking about symbolism, she referenced the work of another guy called Arnold Modell. He wrote a book with another guy called Imagination, and the meaning from right, I can never quite remember the title. And he mentioned another guy called Giambattista Vico, who was his version of Descartes. He thinks like the undiscovered Descartes, which is another thing that I said at the talk. But what he was stressing was a lot of our metaphors come from like bodily sensations. You know, when we say that we're depressed, we talk about it in terms of being down in our body, or we talk about, you know, when we're disgusted with something, we say we're sick to our stomach. And a lot of the metaphors that we use, the most part of the metaphors that we use, are rooted in some way to the body. And it's a point that I would make that I think that we're a lot more symbolic in our thinking just generally, because like there's a thing, lots of areas are linked. If you look at the region of the brain that deals with disgust with food, it's the same area that's involved in moral judgments. if you look at the anterior cingulate dealing with pain, it's involved in social pain and physical pain. Your peripheral vision will improve with your mood. And there was embodied cognition is another big area, and there have been a whole rake of studies that have come out. They've suggested, for example, they had this test where they had the person doing the test, they had a cup of coffee or a cold drink that they gave to someone. When the lift reached the top, they asked them what they thought of the personality of the person who had given them the drink. When it was a hot cup, they felt that their personality was warmer. They did other studies, not this particular group, I think, but where washing your hands would have an effect on your moral judgment, or if you asked people about their life in a particular way that was morally oriented and you give them a choice of objects afterwards, they would go for soap. They found that when a person feels socially rejected, they will perceive a room as being colder. And what I would like to draw from all that is, I think that if you want to connect with the inner experience, a symbolic way of dealing with it, of dealing with your reality, can actually connect with a lot of what's going on there without you knowing it. Like, you wash your hands, you don't realise that you may be changing the way that you think about things morally. What Modell says again and again is that metaphors are the way that we get to our, we bridge the gap between outside objective experience and our subjective experience. Because, as I said earlier, you can have all the well-reasoned arguments in the world, they're not going to get through to a person. You've got to connect with their subjective experience. And it's got to get the different poles of the experience. You can't say, cut your mother out of your life. That's not going to work. I was talking about how symbols are dialectical, and that is what is so important about them. I mean, a lot of the dreams that I have, I have a recurring dream to do with trains, and the train can be viewed in so many different ways. It could be like escaping from one form of symbolic death to another form of symbolic death. It could be, the freedom of moving to a new place, but alternatively, not getting on the train could be a sort of freedom. Trains have compartments which are confining. You can look at things lots of different ways. In Roger's client-centered therapy book, he talks about a woman talking about, she felt like she was in a tomb. And he sort of tried to flip that around, which is kind of rare for Rogers, because he's mostly like, oh, you've said this and you've said this. Maybe it's because he was actually writing a book. He had to, voice an opinion. But you can look at the tomb as being like death or confining or whatever. But you could also look at it as, like an Egyptian tomb. It's full of treasures to do with yourself. And that's a way of flipping the experience around. So if you say like, I feel like I'm in a prison, or I feel like I've missed the boat. You play around with the image. I think that could be more effective. Playing around with that image could be more effective than any good advice. You'd be like, well, what's this prison like? Is there anything good about a prison, a cage, or could you break out from this prison? How does that work? Next thing I want to talk about is creating a space for symbolism. And let me explain this one. This is like, I'm trying to link my very basic knowledge of quantum mechanics to symbolism. So, you can view people, I think, in essentially sort of two different ways. You can view them in sort of like an anatomistic behaviour type sense, or you can look at them in a sort of Martin Buber, I, thou, experience the other person, blah, blah, blah. The whole thing seems to me to be like a waveform that you can collapse into a particle. So, like, you can allow a person to be a person, or you can put some sort of construct or some sort of framework on it. And I think that a lot of therapies, what they do is they create a framework, and through operand conditioning or whatever, I'll hand that over to you in a second. Through that form of conditioning, people start to behave in accordance with it. If you look at the Gloria tapes, you have one woman, she goes in and she has Albert Ellis doing rational emotive therapy. When that happens, all of her problems seem to be rational emotive therapy problems. When you have Frederick Pearl's, he very much focuses on the disconnect between, you know, her smiling and her expressions of fear, and says that it's that kind of conflict that you can see in the body. That's where the real conflict is. That's where a person can't lie. And when you look at Carl Rogers, he's talking about the relationship, and, you know, he doesn't say it in the video, but total organismic rationality. And every time she has slightly different problems to fit it, but they're the same, you know, it's the same waveform of a problem. It's just being collapsed in a different way. So what I think about symbolism is, it's okay, there is normal symbolism in everyday life, but when you're looking at therapy, you'd set aside an hour. If you look at someone like Robert Langs, he has these archetypal sort of ground rules, you know, it's set fee, limitations on extra office contacts, that kind of thing. But in setting those framework conditions, he's kind of creating areas in which counter-transference can kind of flood into those different... What I want is you take the therapeutic situation, you don't look at it like the person is saying exactly that. You look at it like a Robert Frost poem or a piece of art. It's like a creative work or a dream. You could be... Like what Robert Lang says, it's like you have your patient is saying, I feel that my father was brutal to me in this particular way. They're not actually just saying, I feel that my father was brutal to me in that way. They're saying that, but they're also saying that I feel that I'm brutal in a particular way, or I feel the therapist is brutal in that particular way. They could be saying all of those things at the same time, and whichever slant you choose to take on it will solicit more of the same thing. Robert Langs seems to suggest, and Maroda and Yalom, that a lot of things could be just sort of like manifest content. You know, you could be talking about you're displeased that your results have been posted up on the board in your college with your name there where you didn't want other people to see it. But what you're actually talking about is, and this is an example like from Yalom, you know, he has these group sessions and he has students viewing from behind a mirror. It's actually really about the people behind the mirror invading the privacy and the confidentiality of the meeting. And Yalom said as well that, you know, like the therapist's absence, for example, could lead to a whole bout of conversations to do with death. Or Maroda would say that, you know, and following lines again, first words, doesn't matter what they're about, the small talk or whatever that a patient will start into, is not actually about what they're talking about. It's usually a reflection on how they perceive the therapist, like whether they were effective and successful or not during the last session. So Maroda says, you know, negative remarks about authority figures could be thinly veiled criticisms of the therapist. But what you're kind of saying is that every piece of the conversation could be taken as some sort of reflection on the therapist, or maybe some part of themselves. So it is an imaginative work, but it's a way of getting your head around you're treating it differently to a normal conversation, because it is like you're looking at a poem, or it is like you're looking at a dream. And I'm sure it'd be very frustrating if you brought it over into, it'd be madness if you brought it over into every part of life. But when you create this situation where you're like, this is the hour, these are the rules, you're allowing this to flood and everything becomes meaningful. It's the same when you have, when I did a film course recently, well, it's a good while ago now, where it was talking about Méliès, is it Méliès? the French guy, early cinema, the rocket and the moon. You know, that's all about.
You're talking about the brothers?
What's the one where they send it? No, it's
Romeo brothers.
no the rocket in the moon's eye.
Oh, I know what you're talking about. I was thinking of the Lumiere brothers.
And then there was another guy who did
Toward Germany
where he
first.
blows up the head, his own head.
I know,
and
yeah. Practical
tricks and stuff.
Psychology. For right now, I'm kind of just, my mind is set somewhere else. I can't pull up any of those names.
Well, we'll find it out, but
Yeah.
it was about like genital displacement and insecurities and stuff, and they entered into that product because it was a product and it was going to reflect. It was the same thing that I thought about Meshes of an Afternoon, where my Darren has all this shit to do with keys and the phallic imagery there. It was low. Yeah, Robert Langs, I think, is who I was talking about. It's funny when you see. I mean, Maroda references Langs again and says something like, "If a patient notices a new plant in the room," I told you this before, and it's hilarious. But I see a new plant in the room. It's not actually that you're noticing the new plant. It's that it's a reflection of some internal change. Stepping back from the projection and the symbolism for a second, I think it's the Rollo May book that he has on anxiety, he talks about, people can be projecting, but there's a particular reason why they choose to say those things to you at that particular time. And if you're in this other mode where you're not looking for people's behaviours manifested in it, you can see, that this can connect with you. And I think some people are kind of, they like to put everything that other people say, that's just projection, not getting it anywhere.
Yeah.
But there are two different ways of looking at people. And the therapeutic framework is one where you can make everything symbolic, and everything means something about a pattern of behaviours. Like if you in treatment gives a couple of different examples. In that there's Paul West, played by Gabriel Byrne, and his mother, I think, was bipolar or suicide or something like that. So
she was bipolar, yeah.
Was she bipolar?
Yeah, she became suicidal because of it, yeah.
And his transference is obviously an element of the therapy, with the Gina, who's played by Diane Wiest. Diane Wiest?
I think it is, I'll look it up.
She goes, you've put me in the role of the punishing mother because it's comfortable, because it's familiar. And then in the third series with the next woman, there's an element of erotic transference. That's the second time. The first one was with Laura in season 1. But he looks for the caring mother in her, and he tries to give her aspirin and stuff so that she will care for him. I can't remember the entry point at this point. Can you help me?
You were talking, I think, in this case, about how our past relationships, or even the relationships in some way we have now, inform our relationship with the therapist. I mean, that's the whole discussion. But you were saying it in regards to in treatment, you can see with how Paul talks to Gina, his kind of counsellor, his kind of, he's more of a, what is she to him, I suppose?
She's like a supervisor.
She's a supervisor. Every therapist, I suppose, particularly under the APA in America, very strict, has to have some sort of supervisor, and he brings her in as a supervisor again, more so to be his therapist. And the transference there between how he wanted the approval of his mother and how he wanted to satiate his mother's problems comes across in how he wants Gina to validate him, love him, and take him in again as a mother figure. And that's clear in how he tries to identify with her as a child, and sometimes even in fact in a childish way, where he becomes ridiculously aggressive, needlessly so, only as if to look for punishment that he didn't properly receive from his own mother. Yeah. So it's not just a re-engagement with his old mother, it's also an attempt to turn it into an idyllic version of his relationship with his mother. It's also the dreamlike version that he wishes to construct this time as much as reconstruct. I suppose that's the paradox of all these things. It's construction and reconstruction.
Yeah, it's just to try and put some structure for me on this. So we have two versions of, symbolically in the therapy, of transference. The first one is sort of a repetition compulsion style, I will recreate my harsh mother. And in the second one, he creates an idealized version.
Which is actually they believe, or at least people like Peter Brooks and Edward Brannigan and many plot theorists who engage in psychology, this, like, or at least more psychiatry and psychology too.
Yeah.
But they don't engage with it as much, but they look at it in plot and they say that the vacillation of all great stories is not just that a person is compulsively recreating some past problems, some past trauma, but they're also trying to compulsively create something new from it. But it has to be under the same apparatus as what made it.
Yeah, a lot of people have problems when we talk about repetition compulsion. Just to introduce,
it's a Freudian concept.
That idea, yeah.
That I became obsessed with at one point, which is kind of.
Well, do you want to explain a little?
No. I think you should definitely.
Okay, well, it's basically like you're recreating in some form a situation from your childhood. Again, to use another example, from In Treatment, there's a lawyer. It's Mia.
Yeah, it's Mia.
And Paul reveals late in her therapy that the reason that she defends sort of negligence cases for a lot of sort of elderly men is because, in a sense, she's repeatedly defending her father. And in the therapy, the idealization of her father and sort of coming to terms with how he really is, like a bit of a jackass, that there is an example of repetition compulsion. But also, like, in the Yalom book, which was Overcoming Death, what was it? Staring at the Sun, Overcoming the Anxiety of Death. Well, it has a couple of different titles. He talks about this woman who was, I think she was a prostitute and a drug addict, but she would get these pangs for that old lifestyle. And she would think that it was much better when all she had to think about was where her next fix of dope was going to come from. But she omitted to mention like the 3 attempts that had been made on her life. The friend that she saw, I think it was the friend that she saw, was thrown from a roof and killed. And there is this extraordinary unconscious force towards recreating painful situations that have already occurred, because there's some sort of comfort and there is some sort of familiarity that comes with it. And I saw this film, Wasteland, which is about people in Brazil who pick garbage, and at the end of the film it talked about how they had been helped and stuff. But I think 1 or 2 or a lot of them kind of had to come back. They missed the people who were there. Maybe just one person, but I think it was more people. And it is interesting. And again, I forget the entry point into repetition compulsion. It does seem to me that, okay, people have their behaviour.
Yeah.
They have a certain lens with which they view the world, skewed as it is by projection or transference or whatever you call it. And what he does is he brings all that out into the relationship. He creates a place where all of that can come out in the relationship symbolically. Like, if you don't want to pay the fee on time or a prompt manner or whatever, you're probably having trouble in other areas of life. If you show up late to a session, you're showing that your time is more valuable, or it's symptomatic of the way you treat other people. But when you have that information, I suppose, and I've said this to you before, that you can only see that you see that way. It's a very meta type thing. It's a very actually, it seems very cognitive. I know it's supposed to relate to your emotional stuff, but it's kind of like you need them to cover your blind spots. And I know that there's got to be some sort of insight, and it's got to be combined with something that connects emotion. That's where the relationship comes in. But yeah, you see those things, and through that symbolism, you can think later on, like, oh, I do have that blind spot. I do have that thing. I saw that in the symbolism that was created there. Just to put some form, which I was supposed to put on it earlier. We've looked at loads of different types of symbolism. So there's your symbolism in, the words that you use, the way that you relate to the other people as a symbol of your parents. The whole hour is a symbol. like you've heard me say earlier, that the 1 week is a symbol for the success of the week before. All of the content about your life is a reflection on your attitude towards the therapist. But it would also have different symbolic meanings relating to each of those specific things if you're actually dealing with the content in those conversations. So there's so many different directions that you can bring it in.
I would just say that operant conditioning, which is a term I think was coined in 1937 by B.F. Skinner, our great behaviourist friend, who started a number of important tests that destroyed superstition as a concept and helped science kind of gain more ground in the ideas of the behaviour of the brain without so much of the neurological material to back it up, because that would come a lot later when we were more acutely able to monitor brain waves and specifically what the brain is doing electronically and with blood pressure and whatnot. But he coined the term in 1937, and he took it off a guy named Edward L. Thorndike, who experimented with cats in puzzle boxes, and he found that cats in puzzle... Huh? Yeah, exactly. We all had cats. Well, I tortured my cat in my own way. Poor bastard.
With puzzle boxes.
Yeah, exactly. Yeah. Well, mine was pizza boxes, but he found that cats at first trying to figure out these puzzles were highly unsuccessful, and the few ones that succeeded, obviously didn't get much reward, and if anything tried to return to the cats. But over time, the more kind of puzzles that were given to the cats, because they were given a succession of different puzzles, the more they succeeded, no matter how much the puzzles seemed to change a little bit, and they all became highly successful after lots of testing and failure. But they had to fail and get it wrong and do it over and over again, but before you know it, they have conditioned themselves to know exactly how to work it. Yes. Experiments they did on patients back then was this idea of getting them to go through a number of hidden tests, and by hidden tests I mean the therapist would put forward a number of questions, but the patient wouldn't realise they were actually questions that were deliberately made to test them, and they wanted to see what way each patient over a series of, like, I think it was a month or 2 months, it doesn't matter, just say a long time, how each patient would react to these test questions, and they were all the same questions for each one of them. And what they found was that the patients started to respond to these questions in roughly the same way, and in fact took the titles that came with them. So the therapist would start giving them titles, rewarding them in a certain type of dialogue, and then the patient would imbibe that type of dialogue, and they started to act more in that way that they were told they were, showing that just like with the test of puzzle boxes, they saw therapy as symbolic of another problem they had to solve, instead of actually an hour to curate their own life. So what had come about was that therapy was shown to actually have a problem where you were less solving these people's problems than tricking them through conditioning and through authority into believing they were something they were not, who had solved their problem. So it was actually quite sad.
Another thing that I think is, to what extent does the system, the framework of symbols that we choose actually determine the problems we have? Like, if we go out and we look for problems, we're going to find or create problems. And with feelings as well, sometimes you can kind of be like, am I anxious? Am I angry? Am I, I'm not having a laugh. But it's kind of like a generalized whatever. But, maybe it is a generalized whatever, and then we put a thing on it where, like, you're feeling death anxiety. You're feeling death anxiety and, like, you need to get laid. You're feeling a combination of those two things. Here's a symbol. Have a look at that.
It's true, and people are always looking for identification, because one thing they're lacking is identity. And I think the lack is, and I'll always be the person who's promulgating and propitiating this.
Don't get us started on the lack.
Yeah, but the lack is in language.
Yeah.
It's in language. It's why symbols work, because they combine visualization and possibly other forms of cognition, maybe even hearing. They combine the senses as well as seeing together to create a more wholesome media in their brain, if you will, or a medium. So it's not just a set of words. It's a set of words that create an image, and that image has a sense, it has a place. Like they think of the river going to the cave.
I think it helps. I mean, we love...
Which is more than language.
An anti-dromia, which is like opposites come from their opposites. You know, the extremely poor person is obsessed with wealth, the extremely wealthy person is obsessed with money, communists are obsessed with material stuff. And I think what a symbol does is it allows you to get down to the core of like a conflicting experience. Like, you know, in strength there is weakness, in defeat there is victory.
Well, there's more kind of sayings and aphorisms, but yeah, I mean, I see what you...
Yeah, but when you get down to the basis of an idea, there is a conflict, you know.
Well, it's to recognise contradiction without personalisation or anyone's voice over it, I guess. It's that's one way of looking at symbols. I think the other way with symbols, as you were pointing out, is that, and more what I'm getting at now, is that it goes beyond just plain language. A symbol will be a set of words, yes, but what they evoke or elicit out of the person is something so much more. A symbol, by its very nature, is more than just...
Yeah, no, it is. It is beyond words.
Yeah, and that's why it's better.
There's a process there. There's some sort of transcendent quality.
Yeah, and transcending language is something that I think people are trying to do every day, even when they learn language. Even when they're learning more languages, they're trying to transcend its restrictions, its rigidness, its bases, and needing to conform to as many people as possible. They want to find the individuality, they're trying to break through it all, but at the same time they're in the battle, and again another contradiction with conforming to it.
And another thing is emotion. Emotion is messy in the sense that, like, if you have language, you have a clear narrative of events, you know, this thing happened, but in the dreams that I've had, the experiences that I've had, you find confusing feelings, like a feeling of loss before something has happened. Some sort of confusing... It doesn't... Emotions seem to exist outside of time. I've made this point before. Like music, emotion seems to have this transcendent quality. It's like a different part of the brain that's dealing with it. And when you have a symbol, you can organise all of these sort of disparate emotions around one thing. This is a representation for all of that in my life. Mm-hmm. And it makes sense in the symbol, but it doesn't necessarily make sense if you tell it like a story. Like, well, if you take that bit of the feeling of loss that I had there, and this bit of nostalgia that I had here, and this bit of pain I felt on last Tuesday, and you put it together, but then if you put it together in a heart or a cross, now you got something. Now you're going somewhere. It makes sense, or at least it makes sense as long as you don't talk about it. When you start talking about it, it doesn't make sense.
Yeah, absolutely. It applies to it doesn't mean to be general, but it almost is a general conformed unifier in language that everyone's going to understand and won't debate and won't atomize or analyze, and you don't have to get into the nitty gritty of what you said. Like, actually, it's because of this, and this.
I wasn't going to go down this road, but I think I should. I'm going to throw in a few examples of how. Again, this is probably the blog, so it's not entirely new, but of how symbolism saved people's lives and how the process of symbolization on its own can actually protect people. The two examples that I wrote about in the blog are the Man Gulch disaster, which is fire jumpers. They were to put out a forest fire.
I recall this one, yes. And
the people who were able to keep the symbol of a team in their head were the people who survived. So that's the leader who, even though the team completely disintegrated and fucking freaked out with the fire, he still in his head was operating under the assumption that he was the leader of the team, and he burnt a safety fire. So he burns a fire so that the fire has to work around because it doesn't have the fuel. And again, the way that he came to that conclusion was by using symbolism. He was relating things that were not the same from his experience but made sense and making connections. And then there were another two people who got into like a crevice in the wall, and they thought they were acting as two people, and they still had the impression of a team in their head. And there was another example in Mintzberg, I think it's Mintzberg's strategy book, and it was a story about people getting out of the Pyrenees with a map of the Alps, or the Alps with a map of the Pyrenees. I can't remember, but it was like just, you could have an idea. It's like, we love Lost, you know. You put on a school bag and you go, I have a purpose, and you will get some people to follow you. Well, no, not really. We're in the real world, but in maybe one person.
Maybe one or two.
Maybe one of the kids are
one of weak intent or doubtful identity. Yeah, no, it's very true. And you'll certainly convince yourself. Yeah. You'll convince yourself that you do have a purpose. Many a time I've gone on a hike in Three Rock Mountain just wearing a school... Yeah. Well, obviously wearing other clothes, not just naked with a school bag, which would be pretty crazy. No, but... but my intent was to create that effect. And I would play Michael Giacchino music from Lost, but I'd also play other songs, and I would feel like I had a purpose. Like, because I wanted to ascend the mountain, that was the most concrete, real, and right in front of me goal I've ever had in my life. It's there, it's in front, I can actually achieve it. It's tangible, it's reduced to just this gradient in front of me. The challenge is simple, difficult, but simple if you think about it. Not much thought is there, it's just the muscle and the grind. And when then I remember I reached the kind of eastern slope, and everyone knows, I think a lot of people know this bit, where there's a huge amount of, pine and fern and some, mostly evergreen, some fern trees, I think, which are evergreens as well, but these are kind of different. I don't know what breed they are, but they're strange set of trees, strange genus. And but they were coming down at like this steep, almost 30-40 degree angle.
Yeah.
And I decided to cut through the forest to get up to the top, to the largest tower that was there, which is like a radio or signaling tower that you see every night, blinking 4 to 3 different red lights. And I love watching it going home, because it reminds you of Twin Peaks, and also reminds me of Alan Wake when he sees the radio mast that leads you home, that leads you to the top. So I wanted to get to the top through this little forest, but I noticed the sun was going down, and it reached the top part of that angle. So I was going up an incline, and right at the top you have the sun blaring through the trees, but you have all the trees spiraling, or I should say cutting the light, and dissecting the light, and truncating the light so it splits out into rays. And something about walking into that light through the trees at this steep angle, like it was right above me, like it was in my eyes, started to represent a lot of the ways in which, when you take blood out of a brain, when you watch someone dying who believes they're seeing light because it's blood loss, it created that afterlife transcendent feeling. And obviously it's my own brain pulling off this artifice, but it's still brilliant. It's still, for me, numinous in that moment. It doesn't matter that it means nothing to anybody else. And I could only do that through engaging with the mountain, I suppose, and the climb symbolically. And I then elevated the symbol even more, this time for personal use, not for just consumption of others.
Yeah, well, if you're not consciously doing it, you're unconsciously doing it.
Exactly, yeah. It's always active.
A funny thing was, one of the things I talked about in the talk was food as a symbol of affection, but then I read, I think it was Mad, Bad and Sad. I initially skipped the chapters on eating disorders and abuse, because, let's face it, they're depressing. But they have, some of the anorexics have very complex associations with food, and it relates to the way that they relate, I think, to their mothers and stuff, because they'll like have an apple in a handbag, they're like, oh, it's okay to have an apple, I have the love, I can peel the love, but I can't eat the love, because that would be an acceptance of my need of the apple/love. Gokwan in his, we were listening to this in the car on the way back from Cork, and it was Desert Island Discs, which is where they choose all the discs they're going to take to an island. So as he's going through that,
it's a good show. It's a good feature, yeah.
Yeah, no, well, better than nothing. Coming in the car back from Cork. He talks about his very complex association with food, and how his family operated a restaurant, and how, being, putting on weight, eating food was a symbol of success. I mean, or affection as well. I mean, it has a very different meaning for us.
Which is failure and degradation.
Weakness and
definite degradation.
Lack of self-control. And in my dreams, the things that I have with food is like, I have like food on shelves of supermarkets, but behind the food is better food. Or there's food passing itself off as other food. Or there's like a cooler bag which you think has food in it, but it doesn't have food in it. And let's not look into the very obvious meanings if you just simply connect food with love. And let's park that for a minute.
Speaking of parking, didn't you talk about transference earlier on, and you parked that?
I did.
We returned to it. I think we naturally returned to it anyway. We've talked about it enough when we looked at...
Well, transference is the brilliant sort of wow word that, like, if you're trying to sound impressive, you're like, oh, well, I think there might be an element of transference there. Yes. I'd like to say that that there's a field, a transference field or a symbolic field that's created in a therapeutic art. It's created in a lot of relationships and friendships, but if you want to keep friends, you're not going to bring this up, because another thing that I used to think was very clever was, I'd say to friends or whatever, it's like, the stories you tell about yourself and things that have happened to you in the past are actually stories about how you want to be treated now by me. So
I recall this being a similar mode I'd taken. With you at one point.
Yeah, but the unfortunate thing is it eventually backfires on you. Where
It backfired with
yeah.
you. You slapped the
See,
sound.
when you're telling me that story, what are you actually trying to tell me? I'm like, I'm just telling a fucking story.
Yeah.
Would you fuck it off? It only works one way.
This is something you run into quite often.
And you go around, actually, if you fully adopt this mode of, like, yeah, Yalom, he talks about, okay, so he had this group for, like, terminally ill people, and he ran it with, I think, Paul, well, he says Paul, she's Paul in the book, and she gets jealous because he brings in a new therapy intern or whatever the fuck into the group, and they meet up in a restaurant after falling out, and she puts her anger rock on the table, and he, I think, tries to connect it to her dead brother, who is her rock, and then says, like, you know, do you want me to be your rock? I think that's later on. But, you know, it's fun, and it's probably accurate, but it would wreck the head if you were like that all the time. Like, I remember, I thought, when someone plugs their charger into my room, or uses my charger, on an unconscious level, they're trying to steal
Yeah, electricity, yeah.
Or if you look at that lamp, well, the lamp is off screen, but it's called the mother and child lamp. And if you talk about the mother and child lamp, maybe you're commenting on the mother and child
relationship. I had a problem with my girlfriend where the way she treated my room was like she would leave her clothes strewn about the room without cleaning them up or putting them on a hanger. Yeah. And this happens to be the way she treats her own room. In fact, her room is a bomb with just mounted clothes all over.
Well, I would say that the outside represents the inside.
I'm a real traditionalist myself, because of all the environmentalism. So glad when